You're very welcome to this special webinar where we're going to dive into our Premier League report for the 25-26 season. I'm really excited and really privileged to be joined by Dr. Daniel Cohen. Dan, welcome.
Thank you for having me. Excited to talk about this great new release.
For sure. And again, we'll start with some credit, first of all, to both Dr. Morgan Williams and yourself for authoring and contributing to this guide, respectively. I think it's a great piece of work, and it's something that we've released a report on a similar vein last year, and we've really built off that this year. So really looking forward to diving into it with you. And Dan, for the people that I guess maybe don't know a lot about you, and I think that'll be a minority at this stage, do you want to give me a quick 30-second intro into yourself and the work that you're involved in?
Yeah, well, after co-founding Forstex, and this was back in 2012, 2013, which was the Premier League was probably the first, apart from English Institute of Sport, was the major league that we got involved in. After Phil and I sold Forstex to VALD, I've really worked as a consultant in the same space in force plate, Forstex, metric interpretation, support, education, mentorship, principally still in elite football and basketball, but leaned into other sports as well. Continued to have a good relationship with VALD, and I'm sometimes invited to conferences as well. And do a bit of research as well. Sorry.
Yeah, just a little bit of research as well.
Yeah.
No, for sure. That's great. So I'm it's really nice to be talking to you because you're actively involved in the sport that we're talking about. You're a bit of a subject matter expert, which is great for some applied insights, which we'll get into a bit later into the presentation as well. But what I want to do is make this conversational and make this, quite informal as well. It's not going to be one question and a 10-minute answer from yourself. Let's have a bit of back and forth, and I'll probably challenge you on some things or push back on some things to see what your thought process is behind it as well. But should be good. Right. So we'll jump straight into things here. And what I want to do first of all is just highlight the scale of this report. So when you jump into the introduction and the strength in numbers section, we always have these sections in our reports. But for the 2025-26 season just gone in the Premier League, we've collected, or at least VALD Technology, in partnership with the various clubs, has collected 150,000 tests and over 300 unique test types, which is, frankly, just astonishing that amount of data at such a high level.
Phenomenal.
And then I guess the final piece as well is that across the last 5 seasons, on 98% of all available days, data has been collected using VALD technology. And I think that just goes to show where this objective measurement, technology and other similar technologies have gotten to now, that they're a crucial part of the process rather than, something where, you're an early adopter, you're chasing a bottleneck, you're trying to get the extra 1%. This is potentially now becoming the 80, 90% that people have to do.
The blood pressure cuff of sports, in a sense. Sure. Yeah, fundamental core objective data, not seen as a sort of niche or a cutting edge technology. It's so widely used. Amazing to see, especially from the perspective of when we used the term strength in numbers some years ago. The idea was pulling together actually Premier League teams to collectively look at trends and particularly injury risk or potential injury risk that a single club couldn't do on their own. But the sort of scale of strength in numbers is just on another level, and fantastic to see how that's being analysed. And give credit obviously to Morgan, who did that hard graft of pulling that data. Phenomenal.
For sure. For sure. And I'll jump into two kind of similar graphs here now to get us going, Dan. But you'll see on the top of your screen here, we've got our year by year usage, and it's incrementally increasing, which is great. Every single year, there's just more tests done across a total season. But one of the peaks that seems to just occur every single year is in that preseason phase, where significantly more amounts of tests just get completed. And my mind would go towards intakes, seeing players for the first time in maybe a while after the holiday period of summer. But I just want to probe you, Dan. What exactly would be going on there with that significant increase in tests?
Yeah, I think, as you say, it's intake. I mean, pre-season, first day of pre-season often, or soon thereafter, especially with the nature of the commercial demands and the travel that can come soon after that, and certainly in some cases it's being done maybe later, but I think the majority would be that first return and that classic pre-season profile, which is many years ago was the only, that would be the spike, and that would be the test, but I guess there's also the element of the volume, the sort of lack of difficulty in organising that. It's days that are dedicated to and expected to be dedicated to that, not just obviously only force plate testing, or not even just VALD testing, but physiological fitness testing in the old vernacular.
Yeah. For sure. And I think we'll finish on that topic with just another graph here. And this is from last year's guide, but I think it really just goes to show the scale of data that we're talking about. So if we bring it all the way back to 2021, just, post-COVID, or potentially still in COVID for certain parts of the year, our largest testing week was, south of 2,000 tests in a week, which in 2021 was a gigantic number and something you'd be very proud of. And in 2025, the weekly testing average absolutely dwarfs that, never mind the maximum amount of tests that have been done in a single week in 2025. So this just goes to, show that growth. And again, it's nice to see across the season that the testing continues, and it's not just, as you said, the way that it used to be, one spike and that's it.
I mean, the ease of use there, sorry to cut you, the ease of use and the sort of the integration features, the practical features, workflow and so forth, as I guess looking at that is yes, there is a bigger spike for pre-season, and that's probably partly maybe the number of teams and the number of tests as well. But I think probably the impact has been even greater on the in-season, the capability to integrate and to get those response and trend data that before was kind of a bit elusive or difficult to implement.
For sure. And I guess the final piece, and it's maybe adjacent to the VALD topic, but the amount of data that must now be available to these teams when you think about the similar technologies, or even the technologies that are in the same departments, so GPS, heart rate, the subjective element of it as well. It's quite difficult to almost comprehend the amount of data that a team now needs to collect, analyze, and potentially use to inform decisions, isn't it?
Well, and I guess the trends in, or the ensuing AI is going to help with that, but I think also having the VALD hub, in which at least the neuromuscular, or probably the majority of the neuromuscular, or if not all, the neuromuscular is at least in one place. At least it's accessible, and teams are going to use other forms of visualization, etc. But as that gets better, and I'm sure we'll touch on different visualizations later on, but that's certainly a bottleneck, or not a bottleneck, but a burden that needs to be dealt with as well in a way that the data can not be seen as a burden and seen as an opportunity, cross-referencing the different tests and so forth.
For sure. For sure. No, I completely agree with that. It's going to be an interesting few years now with AI and with the amount of data that's coming. But again, hopefully it'll be a beneficial few years. So what I'll do now, Dan, is I'll jump into this kind of topic of conversation, and it's around the current testing landscape in the elite game of football. This is from last year's report, and it's just a distribution table of some of the key tests, and by the teams on the y or the x-axis on top there, and we can see some clear trends into some of the key tests. So we think about football, and we think about potentially injury risks first and foremost, hamstrings from high-speed running, groins, and we can see that the teams are choosing to collect data on tests that will give them some information around those areas. So the Nordic, the force frame, hip ab test. But of course, the CMJ is top of the list for the majority of teams there. And I don't think that's a surprise that to many people, that the CMJ is just widely regarded as the go-to test now for a range of different sports. But what I want to jump into here, Dan, is why is the CMJ top of that list for the majority of teams? Is it a convenience thing? Is it sheerly the amount of data or the amount of quality data you get, or is it a hybrid of both?
I think it's a hybrid, and I guess you would want, even if, let's say, the emphasis was on convenience initially, that emphasis increasingly is on, as you mentioned, the quality of the data, the insights you can gain from the test. But certainly, I think there's nothing wrong with initiating something on the basis that it might be easier to initiate, easier to introduce, easier to integrate. Obviously, it would be important that test and that data ultimately is going to be valuable, but then it, in essence, being able to deliver first is critical. And I think probably that can be built on once there's a culture of assessment, and there's certainly it would be seen as a lower burden, a less, I mean, none of these tests are invasive in the sense of like blood tests, but less demanding, less invasive than, let's say, a drop jump, which would be done twice a week or once a week, and so I think those are the practical features. And certainly, I always say it's not that the information is necessarily better than other tests. It's different. There's different information, but the information gain over just an output, the output that we used to get, the jump height output, the information gain alongside that is huge. Mm-hmm. And therefore you can get so much out of that test, bearing in mind it's still not the whole picture, but it gives a range of neuromuscular qualities.
Yeah. So you raise an interesting point there. The jump height I think jump height is probably where CMJ is the most used test. Jump height may be the most looked at metric just by default. But with the lens towards data hygiene and all of the potential additional metrics that you can collect and the insights you can gain, I'm just curious on your experience, and we're not going to name drop teams or practitioners or anything, but from 2014 onwards, 2015 onwards, how did you see the execution of the CMJ evolve? Was there a gigantic need for education around protocols, or was it just that easy to collect good data all the way through?
I don't think it necessarily comes naturally and is easy, but fundamentally, I think once you have the culture, the player buy-in, some of those issues that we say are protocol issues are to some degree taken care of, because if the players themselves are engaged with it, if there's the feedback, all of those things, then even the reliability tends to improve because of that effort that's going in. And just want to pick up on that data hygiene, which was because it links back into your question about the CMJ and the other tests. I think as much as there is variability in the degree of reliability across CMJ metrics, when it comes to some of these other less, or let's say more technical tests with more degrees of freedom, more things to think about and apply during the test, then that reliability can get worse. So, as much as we can complain about reliability sometimes with certain metrics in the CMJ, when you come to those others, the data shows that you're likely to be broadening, increasing those CVs. So yeah, I think back to your point about, or the question about how it's evolved, I think that's the player buy-in and the fact that the culture is being set more and more. And as players are coming through from academies where maybe it had been implemented, but not in a first team environment so readily. Years ago, it was easier to maybe implement in the academies, and so there's that McDonald toy type of thing that have been used to that, those tech toys and that sort of feedback and expect it.
Great. No, that's really good insights, and it's always a question that I would get from clients as well, that the CMJ is the most popular test, but why exactly is it so popular? So I think we've answered that there, which is great. Yeah. So let's keep the conversation going now, and we've established the current landscape of testing. But in the 2025-26 report, one of the interesting sections that we've identified is there's been a rapid uptake, let's call it, or an increase in popularity of certain tests. And we've got the force frame and force decks as an example here, with seated ankle plantar flexion, so the calf Achilles complex, supine knee flexion, potentially looking at the hamstring. And we've got squat assessment, IMTP, squat jump, and single leg drop jump appearing to increase in popularity. And that's not to say that these tests, weren't being performed before the season just gone, but there has been a significant uptick in them. And I wanted to, probe you down on why would that be? And I've seen trends before where there may be an injury epidemic with a certain sport. Obviously, you want to gain as much data as possible on that. But within the Premier League specifically, what are your thoughts on, why that may have occurred?
Well, looking at the force decks test that the four tests that you've highlighted there that have increased, whatever, significantly or dramatically, or I guess the squat assessment for me is maybe partly because people are becoming increasingly aware of it. It's been in the system for a while, but having a test that, and I obviously don't know whether this is healthy or rehab, but my assumption, and it might be wrong, that it's a test that maybe practitioners or physio medical side are using to enable some earlier measurements during rehab, or some less impact dynamic measurements, which this allows. But I don't know if it's that, or if there's even tests being done as part of monitoring. That I'm not sure about. I'm not aware of it in that context. Mid-thigh pull, isometric mid-thigh pull surprises me a little that would be increasing. I would be expecting that, if anything, it would be decreasing with the advent of the run specifics, and maybe the recognition of the value of the belt squat and some of these other measures of that extension for peak force. So that's a curious one for me. I don't know maybe it's one team or two teams, but yeah, because it's been around. It's not a new test, and I'm not aware of any specific new research that would inspire people at this moment to do that. And it's not one that necessarily of that complement of possible options for football, for lower body strength or extension that I would necessarily choose. So yeah, I'm not sure. Squat jump, I'm also not sure as to why, but I applaud. I do like the squat jump as a test. I mean, I like the data, the fact that the movement from zero, the concentric or the upward only element of it, I think is very applicable. And I think it's a differentiator as well from some of the data that I've looked at the highest level. I think it's just one of those that has been quite difficult to get right as a pure squat jump. And so, but I think great that it has. I don't know if it's driven by an interest in the composite, the elastic utilization ratio, but I'd hope that it's also been done for its own outputs apart from any ratio. And then single leg drop jump, I would guess that, and I've seen that definitely in places. I mean, that's one that I've witnessed the increased integration. I think probably a big part of that is the work from Aspetar, Ruler and other work, Paul Reed and Uka Maestroni and so forth as first authors at least, around the delivery of that in rehab and the idea of integrating a more demanding test in later stages. So and maybe Jason Pedley's work as well with the early peaks and Ender King's in that same area. So there's a nice volume of work around the value of the SLDJ in rehab, which I guess is probably driving that's filtered through, and people are finding it useful. So
great. I think it's nice to have insight to data like this, because where we may not have the context of being involved in these teams, we can observe that, okay, we have seen an uptake in these specific tests. We may not necessarily know why, but it is something to keep an eye on with regards to the state of the industry and potentially what these teams are doing. So it's good to have that, and it's also good that even your answer there, you've approached it with a degree of uncertainty as well, which is potentially a good thing.
Yeah.
If we keep the conversation kind of moving forward here, so with the CMJ, which we've alluded to a decent bunch now up until this point, we've also got extensive normative values now on the squat jump, the single leg jump. So a range of different, let's call them styles of jumps, all assessing lower body function just in different ways and different scenarios. But what I wanted to jump into here is the CMJ we've established is such an important test. But with the squat jump, with the single leg jump, what are we getting additionally? So what can practitioners take from this data that maybe they're just not getting with the bilateral CMJ?
Yeah, well, I mean, as mentioned, that really pleased to see the increasing use of the squat jump, and I think the demand, the different demand, the starting from zero, so to speak, the lack of pre-stretch, the pure, upward phase concentric outputs, the possibility to get an RFD, a concentric RFD, which is pretty fraught in a CMJ, and I wouldn't depend on it. So I think maybe there is it's a feature of, again, the culture of assessments being better integrated and buy-in. So there's tests where maybe you're going to have to ask them to do another trial, and it's going to be a little bit more demanding. I mean, not the test itself, but the fact that you're going to have to. It's technical. It cannot go right. You're going to have to, and potentially there's just more space to be able to deliver those, because the relationship, the way that the practitioners are delivering these tests to players, that it's not seen as so much of a burden as it might have been in the older days. And the stuff that I had to deal with, and the we don't jump in the game, and all of these things. I always talk about these anecdotes about do I have to do another one, and so forth. So I think, but yeah, apart from the neuromuscular aspect of it, that you're getting some different, you're getting some different information.
I think just if I jump in on that, Dan, before I get too much, the nice part, and I've seen this with the teams that I've been lucky enough to visit and be involved with, it's not really the introduction, because it's always been around, but auto detect and the emergence, I guess, or the knowledge that people now have around using the auto detect feature on force decks, it enables you to actually quickly collect these tests. And there is a line that you're crossing all the time, or you're trying not to cross, where you don't want to have a battery of 5 tests on auto detect, because there will be an element of fatigue, and there will be an element of maybe player frustration as well if you get them to do that. But I've seen personally, at least, the CMJ, the squat jump, and the single leg jump can be done now in probably 90 seconds or less with an athlete, and it gives you a comprehensive data set, but it also is quick, it's efficient. You don't have to do the test, stop the test, jump back in and restart the process, because when you're in that environment, time is the ultimate commodity. You don't really have time to do that. So that's just an interesting, maybe a use case that I've seen practitioners at the highest level using force decks. They seem to be leaning on auto detect a lot more across the years.
Right. I just want to. I mean, it's mentioned in the report, and the addition of RSI mod in the squat jump, which is typically associated with CMJ, which I think is a nice addition, as well as a efficiency type of measure. And I know with Phil Graham-Smith, Dr. Phil might not be so pleased about the RSI mod element, and it could just as well be FTCT, right? It's but the point of just having that output of jump height against time taken, I think is something that's welcome in there, and maybe hasn't that been really used so much. But yeah, bearing in mind those things, and the muscle group involvements, differential muscle group involvements as well, which I wanted to to add to that, the neuromuscular demands. But
I guess with that's a squat jump. So with the single leg jump, I know you've got a plethora of work out there now as well. Like your Not Half an Apple paper, for example. So there is some work that's looked into the single leg jump versus the bilateral CMJ. And I think if we could quickly even just run through some of the benefits, the differences, and maybe the reasons that you would opt for a single leg jump over a CMJ, that might be beneficial to practitioners as well.
Well, I guess the half an apple concept was that there was a couple of papers at least, and sort of narratives around which is better for asymmetry measurement. And, the single leg jump is a pure measure of capacity, whereas I'm talking about with asymmetries, and the double leg is a combination of capacity differences plus strategy, compensatory strategy difference. So it's a less pure measure. And I think that's probably true. I mean, you may want compensatory strategy. That's part of, I guess, the reason for evaluating asymmetries, or it's something valuable that comes from that measurement. So I felt like it's not an either or. I think there are really clear differences, as in that paper, the eccentric peak velocity is nearly double in the bilateral CMJ. The center of mass depth, deflection is much greater in the double leg. but there's also a lower demand. I mean, you're on, the obvious one. You're on one leg, from a force demand and also from the balance and coordination. So I think it's a currency that it feels to me like that should be a core test, either that or the single leg drop jump. And there's that's another discussion, but a single leg jump measure.
Yeah.
But
one thing, Dan, I'll jump in and I told you I'd push back and I'd I'll do that with the EPV being, you said it was double in the CMJ versus the SOJ, roughly double. Would you advise then if an athlete or a practitioner wants to gain insights on their athletes with regards to their ability to decelerate? So would you say that because they're moving at a higher speed in the bilateral, that would be a better assessment of their deceleration abilities, or would you still do it on the single leg, albeit at a much lesser speed?
Yeah, it's a great question, because countering the fact that it's faster is there's less demand, and deceleration, I mean, I don't think neither of them are going to be highly related to horizontal deceleration capacity, but they are a vertical change of direction, deceleration and reacceleration. So I would say, again, I'm not sure that there's one that's better. I think from what I've seen, the velocity element is very useful in unmasking or expressing characteristics that are in that still long stretch shortening cycle, but those elastic characteristics and the fact that you're getting the greater depth as well, so it's in a greater knee flexion, I think is really relevant, those two features. On the other hand, the force demands are maybe what is the challenge, or what the deficit is in that individual. So I think cross-referencing is where it really comes alive. I'm not suggesting a ratio of like a bilateral deficit type of ratio, but just understanding what value you can take from those two different tests, even in the eccentric phase. Now, I think that the important thing for me, though, is that, and it's great to see that the data's obviously been outliers removed and been clean, etc. Now, in reality, what I've seen a lot of is single leg jumps that are, apart from being slow, but even are too slow for a single leg jump EPV. And this is, it's more likely to happen than in a double leg. Tends to be more of a tentative, and particularly in early rehab, you may get a 0, even though it's not 0, but it doesn't register the eccentric phase properly. So,
good.
Yeah, I think, again, if it's not half an apple, it's an orange, and we want more than one fruit in the fruit salad, right? So, I guess that was part of the other end of the thing.
I love that. I think, I just wanted to push back, because when I hear about different velocities, I immediately go to the ability to decelerate. So it's more playing devil's advocate than anything else. But no, that's great. So we'll keep the show rolling here, Dan. And one of the other things that I always like to stress when we talk about normative data reports, we often give medians and we give different percentiles, and we may separate it by position, we may separate it by preseason and in season, and so on and so forth. But to be brutally honest, these are singular data points for periods of time. And one thing that I'm very keen, and I know you are as well, on stressing, is that you have to take them with some consideration of the context, the time of day in the week that you might be the time of week, that you may be testing, or the time of the season, if it's month to month. And we've got examples here from last year's guide where we looked at it longitudinally, and we saw some month-to-month trends and some weekly day-to-day trends as well. I think with the day-to-day trends, it's it's quite. If you had a hypothesis, you would aim towards being fresh or fresher for the game at the weekend. But I think from a month-to-month point of view, let's just quickly talk about that and what should practitioners be considerate of, because I'm very weary of people getting, for example, one of our normative data tables and saying this is where you should be, no matter if it's September, if it's January, or if it's March time. There are some context that need to be applied there as well.
Yeah, I mean, I think what this data from last year was really granular in having those month to months, and probably what was really stuck out, and I was happy to see that. I've seen that in basketball as well, and seen that on smaller data sets. But those key metrics, or some of the key metrics, at the end of the season were higher than at the beginning. Now there is, as we can see, some peaks and troughs, but ultimately, the season from a neuromuscular perspective led to positive adaptation overall. Again, this is overall, and there are some troughs. I think in terms of whether, when you say the norms and whether they could be used globally, I think though that with that amount of data, I think they can be used, because in essence the individual player themselves that you're putting that norm against is, as you say, different conditions coming in, but this data in some extent, I guess, washes out all of those different conditions, and I think gives you still a good reference point. But great to see that one from those those day to day, most of those indicators are showing, yes, towards the end of the week, better performance, but also later part of the season. There are periods around December, particularly December, January, you see those troughs in performance, but ultimately recovery above earlier values.
For sure. And I think we can probably give a pat on the back to the performance staff and people that are involved, because they do seem to be navigating the demands now, and they have a better understanding for it. And I'm sure the calendar will change in time, or something else will be thrown at them, but hopefully they'll be able to adapt to that as well. But it certainly is, like, it's a positive reflection of staff are at.
Yeah. And even with the sort of shrinking pre-seasons, with the tours and so forth. Yeah,
for sure.
Very very nice to see that.
Yeah. So let's just jump into some of. I've got, I think it's 3 key insights now that are in the report that's just been released. And the first one is, yourself and Morgan have looked at concentric impulse at 100 milliseconds against just total concentric impulse across the concentric phase, and you've been able to group athletes into 4 quadrants here. And again, you can do this yourself on VALD Hub now with the quadrant feature, the visualization feature there. So please have a go at that if you've got data and you want to experiment and see where your athletes fit. But before we dive into maybe what the graph tells us, Dan, can you just explain concentric impulse at 100 milliseconds and the total version of concentric impulse as well? Because to the best of my knowledge, it's a Forstex specific metric.
The 100, it was put in. I think it went in there as a alternative to a con RFD, or as a sort of proxy for rate. Obviously, it's not a rate, because impulse are not. These metrics are net impulse, so above body weight, the area under the force time curve, across the phase, the whole phase, in terms of the total con impulse. And the idea of again, it's an arbitrary 100. Why not 90? Why not 80? An arbitrary 100 as one does with RFDs. And there's a 50 millisecond version as well, which may even prove to be more discriminatory, more differentiatory, or more sensitive. But I guess that the idea of putting a marker or asking for how much force can be produced in that limited space of time, because you could say P1, P2 are sort of similar, but the time, they're percentages of the total, whereas this is just simply, you're up against it, 100 milliseconds. Doesn't matter how long the whole concentric phase is, how much is produced, it starts at the force at zero velocity, how much force can you retain or transfer? And it is highly related to EDRFD. I think that in the Premier League data, it's 0.8 correlation with EDRFD. It's got a lot more in common with that than it has with the rest of the concentric phase. I think it's about a 0.4 correlation with the part 2 or the overall con phase. So that's why to bring in those correlations, I think is just important, because they are different. They're not, there's an association, it's significant, but it's fairly moderate given it is the same phase. So what you're trying to understand is within that total, which is affected by the magnitude of force and the time over which it's applied, this is a capped, time-constrained force in that early part coming out of the deepest part of the movement.
Makes sense.
So I think important.
That's really good. It's nice to set the scene to understand the metric before we dive into this. So with this quadrant graph, Dan, we've divided it into high output and high rate, first of all, the top right quadrant. And then we've got a variation of different conditions, low output, high rate, low output and low rate, or high output and low rate. Can you just explain, what this might mean to practitioners? So if I've got a group of athletes, and albeit that we've spoken about this before, this is not separated by positional data, and you may get more insights if it's separated by position. But from a global top level point of view, if I've got athletes in each of these quadrants, what typically is that telling me about them?
Well, first off, the quadrant, and this for me would be part of a feedback to a team. This would be one of the quadrants I have been using. And you can get a ratio. There is a ratio in ForceDex, which, of the overall or the con 100 to the overall. But I think just seeing the position rather than turning it into ratio, and seeing the position of each of these, I guess you could start from the point of view, okay, high con impulse is that player achieving impulse that they're able to produce it not only across the whole phase, but in that early transition. And then you ask the question, well, they're up on the y-axis. Okay, I'll expect the same with the other component. No, they're down here. So the context that might be going with that is, now let's look at concentric duration, for example, in the norms, and where do they fit in that? Is it just they're taking a lot of time? Is the CM depth very high? So that would sort of explain it. But even so, you can have the time constrained piece could independently be high or low, and therefore that's going to inform maybe training emphasis or just understanding of the qualities that player has and how they're producing force across that phase. I would say if it should inform training. If, again, from a positional standpoint, the con 100 and the very early application of force, the rapid early application of force, particularly in that deeper position, because I think we need to consider as well that again, being a bilateral CMJ, you're talking about a fairly deep, relatively deep position. Is that really critical to that player position, or actually are they? Is it not? And is the overall force just more important? And we have to say, of course, con impulse overall is a major determinant of jump height. So it's kind of a proxy, or it's a determinant of the output. So it comes back to that output against application into the ground within that limited space of time.
Great. The thing that jumps to me then is, I know you mentioned that it could potentially inform training with a range of different contextual factors, of course. But if you look at this graph now, is there anything that from the teams you've been involved with down through the years, would you look at any of these quadrants and think this is a red flag and I have to intervene here, or is it more of an observation and you monitor it over time?
I don't think red flag. I think the other bits of context. So again, looking at the context of the time relative. Again, I think the mismatch is where the flag, whether it's red or not, but the flag comes in. So they're in a very high percentile in something where you'd expect the other metric to also be in a high percentile, but it's not. So why, what is it? Why are they moving in that way, which is so unusual and, counterintuitive to what you'd expect at a very specialized level. The other thing I'd say is that I would sort of then go backwards, as I alluded to the eccentric phase and the contribution or the correlation. So if the con impulse 100 is poor, is it also the deceleration phase output? Is that also poor? Is that the origin of it, or is it actually that's fine, but there's a real major drop off in that early concentric phase? So I think it's that problem solving of flag or note to establish what that deficit relates to, what's driving it, what's underneath it.
So we'll jump then down into asymmetries, which I think is a topic that we could have a separate webinar on. There's so much to talk about and you've got so much experience with it. But what we've done in the current report is we've showcased these two visualizations of the squat jump and the counter movement jump, both bilateral efforts, and they have some similarities to them with the concentric phase. And the concentric phase is typically a lot narrower with regards to the bandwidth of asymmetry across the percentiles. And then we see in the landing phase and also the eccentric phase for the counter movement jump, those asymmetries are potentially a little bit wider, some more room left to right with regards to asymmetry. So what I wanted to jump into here, Dan, is if we could just get your insights on what those asymmetries are looking like compared to what maybe your perception of asymmetries from all of your work in football was like. Does it line up, or is it?
Yes, yeah, it lines up, and I think it's so important seeing this. It's a great graphic as well. It's really, really nicely done. That it directly challenges, although I don't know that people hold on to that universal threshold, 10% concept, because it may be just a matter of habit almost. And in the jumps, it's evident that it's not just phase differences, although overall, yes, the eccentric and the landing, the bandwidths, the means or medians in football are higher than, and in fact, globally, not just in football, are higher than concentric. So if you apply a 10% cut point in globally across that movement, you're going to end up with sort of 80 to 90%, let's say 60. I think we actually did the numbers of one of the VALD conferences, around 68% of players would fall into an elevated asymmetry category if you use 10% with an eccentric deceleration RFD as the cut point of 10%. But using that for a concentric metric, you're actually more or less there and about a half a standard deviation, which is what I use. I mean, I tend to use a mean and a half a standard plus half a standard deviation as an indicator of elevated asymmetry. But it's visually very clear, and the numbers are similar to. We did Luke Hart's the first author on that, looking at pre-season footballers with or without severe lower limb injury the previous season, and there were certain metrics that were still elevated relative to those. I mean, asymmetries elevated relative to those who hadn't had an injury the season before, a severe lower limb injury. But certainly those cut points where it was really evident that you have to do metric specific cut points on whether you choose to use the median and a percentile or half an SD, as I do, mean plus half an SD. They need to be specific to the metric being used to be able. I mean, again, whether that's going to be a red flag or not, but it's a flag. It's an anomaly, which again, you ask further questions. You might look at the single leg asymmetry. You might look at, where do they sit? Are they strong asymmetrical, weak asymmetrical, and those, context around the importance of that and the concern that goes along with it. But at least you start by getting a decent classification that is reflective of the normal asymmetries in the sport, which are pretty high or much higher in certain metrics than others.
And what are your thoughts on the landing, phase of these movements? We've had conversations before, obviously, on it, but large asymmetries in landing, and potentially, at least my assumption is, athletes may not be cued how to land, because the test itself may be, designed or programmed to assess some of those pre-flight strategies or pre-flight capacities. So just what's your thoughts on that? Is that something we should be taking as a gospel, or should there be some caution with it?
I mean, I've got to admit, one of the first analyses that I did in EPL was back in, I don't know, it was 2014 or so at Arsenal, looking at force asymmetries in force in CMJ, single leg jump, drop jump, etc., against prior injury, and there wasn't the range of metrics that we even had early days in force. It was before that, but the peak landing force was the most significant of all the things we looked at in terms of association with prior injury. It was the largest differential between those that hadn't and had been injured. And the reason for looking at it was obviously the drop jump history, the use of peak landing force in drop jump. Now, I think we differ on this. I actually think the landing, not cueing the landing and just getting, as you would in a sports situation, the focus is on the takeoff and jumping as high as possible. The landing is not cued or focused on, provides a more natural and, let's say, a lack of preparation, but revealing what the strategy would be. Now, obviously there's downsides to that, and there's potentially the contribution of how they take off to how they land, the position. There is a lot of variability. Yeah. I mean, and again, rulers, the Kotsifakis work with identified it as one of the important asymmetries at RTS post ACL, but also that variability that you see makes it, difficult, or it feels difficult to hang your hat on it, so to speak. But I think it's useful. I don't think it should be ignored, particularly during rehab. And I think I would question, because once we go with bandwidths, we're not talking about high asymmetries. We're talking about high asymmetries in a sport with already high thresholds. So it's anomalous even. So I would ask further questions. I wouldn't ignore an elevated asymmetry in the landing phase completely. I would certainly ask questions about whether there was some incomplete rehab of knee or ankle, for example. Yeah. So
no, I see where you're coming from there. Yeah. I like that we differ on it because it gets conversations like this. It's good. For me, it was always, if I wanted to look at the capacity to tolerate landing, I would maybe resort to an isolated test like a land and hold or a depth drop or something. But to your point, what goes up must come down regardless. If they jump in a game, they have to land again. So you are potentially getting, I'm not going to say ecologically valid insights, but insights that are a bit more relevant to what will happen after a jump. Yeah. And you could have the argument that a CMJ is never done on the field. It's a one-legged push, or it's never hands on hips. I'd like to see Cristiano Ronaldo try that, but
they're probably more balanced than ever would be in reality in terms of going up and it's
for sure. But it's good, and again, it's not that I've got a strong opinion, or it's not a hill that I'm looking to die on. It's just something I've done in the past. So it's a nice insight, and I think that brings us nicely onto our final insight here. So reactive jump testing is a section in the guide that's just been released as well, and we've got insights into the drop jump, single leg drop jump, and the hop test. And the one thing that jumped out to me, pardon the pun, is pre-season and in-season. There wasn't really much change between the medians, at least, and even the upper and lower percentiles. So to me, at least, I kind of went to, okay, our athletes potentially coming to pre-season already in shape, already in very good shape, because we know now that athletes have their own fitness regimes and trainers in the off season and stuff, and that's potentially one thing. But I wanted to check with you: is that normal, and has that always been normal that the preseason and in-season reactive strength profiles wouldn't really differ, or has that changed over time?
I think it's a difficult one in that there hasn't been so much of this data as you highlighted initially, as the single leg drop jump in season. Obviously, some of those, a substantial amount, may be injured, maybe rehab assessments, but they can't all be. So there must be teams that are also doing that during the season, and I don't think that would have been the case before. So I think also, as we discussed a bit earlier, the granularity of the previous report, where you're seeing that there are peaks and troughs, and then in this instance, what we're getting is a median of the whole season. It may be, the conclusion from the previous one that is we end up a little bit higher than at the pre-season. But when you consider all the data points, it might be washing out those peaks and troughs. So I'm not sure I would necessarily draw a conclusion around trends to that extent with those two blocks of data. Mm-hmm. But I might be wrong, that it's probably mathematical and sort of understanding the composition of that, that data to be able to really conclude that one way or another. But yeah, your point about maybe better off seasons, that's something that I guess is newer. Mm-hmm. Give a plug to 292 and Ben Rosenblatt and the others that do these off-season programs.
I think it's becoming almost an expectation now, rather than a nice to have or someone who's going above and beyond. I think it is just you're expected to show up in game ready condition for preseason. I would say, and it's no different in North America across NFL, NBA, all these
Right.
sports. Time is just so precious now that they
Yeah.
can't really afford to be
Yes. Right,
working on.
and all the data around intensity of the increase in intensity of games and the more number of games, etc. Yeah, and then the smaller preseason. So,
I guess one of the pieces that I really took from the guide as well around reactive strength or reactive jump testing is this section I've got on the screen here. So we looked at published professional football data from Rula Kostafaki and her Aspetar group, which like the back of your hand at this point, I would imagine, with the data. But there was some interesting kind of statements made that the Premier League athletes showed higher jump heights, less counter movement depth, less contact time as well, which might indicate greater levels of stiffness, and that's in the single leg drop jump, and it was even amplified further in the bilateral. So I'm keen on your thoughts, and maybe if you want to give us a quick insight into exactly what we're comparing here as well.
Yeah. Well, when that paper, I guess that paper, she's done several, and there's been several out of the Aspetar in that area. But I think it's a 2023 with the single and double leg CM, or the single leg up and the CMJ, the single and double leg drop jump, and the analysis and the patella versus hamstring and the norms, and I guess what also came out of that is the sort of recommendations or the benchmarks in case you don't have pre-injury data. There is a supplemental file which I asked for, which has, there is within the paper, there is the control group. So what I did was I took the control data, which is several hundred. I think it's over 400. I think if I remember correctly, and just took the control data as a control, if you like, a control professional football. It's professional football against a Premier League, which is obviously it's Qatar League versus Premier League. You would expect the Premier League to be higher. I think what the interesting bit is that it's a non-uniform differences. So if everything was higher, you say, well, there's kind of nothing to see here. You're expecting that. But what's interesting, maybe even a little bit more in the drop jump than the single leg drop jump, is that the differences are very much larger in terms of contact time, of like a larger difference, much shorter contact time, but only a smaller 5% difference in jump height. In the single leg drop jump, it's a bit of a different story. The jump height and the contact time are sort of equally higher. And that may be because of the increased sort of force demands of the single leg. But once you get I guess parallels with the single leg jump and the CMJ, once you get the reduce the force and there's a bit more velocity, or there's less of a force demand, and therefore velocity can be expressed more, the differences really come out. And so I think that's it brings out that, first of all, that non-uniform difference, but it also highlights to us that the elite level, the Premier League level, is just such for specific metrics at least, just so superior to pro football generally. And I know in the last report, you have the Championship and other leagues, the differences are smaller. Obviously, the differences are smaller between them. I looked at the Colombian First Division against Premier League, and again, there were specific metrics, and the CMJ has the same non-uniform concentric peak power, 10% higher than the control Aspetar players, the pro players there. Eccentric peak power, 55% higher in the Premier League. So that was the aim of sort of using a control football group and seeing which metrics really light up over others, if there were. I mean, again, I don't think it'd be that interesting if they all were better to the same extent, but this is the data shows, and it shows the importance of having elite reference data for rehab, and the SLDJ, that addition, a fantastic resource, because many teams will not have, or for many players, there might be individuals, they might be doing it, but a new player comes in, or from a team that it's not maybe widespread enough that they will necessarily have a pre-injury data point. And so this data becomes, invaluable as a reference.
Yeah, that's a really nice description of it. It's better than I could have delivered there. And I'm curious on that. Like, do you have insights, Dan, on positional groups? Was there any differences among the positional groups or age profiles? Because I know the Q League is variable across that as well. But if you've got access to that, it'll be interesting. And if you don't, that's fine as well. Well,
I did an analysis, the Premier League analysis that the other Premier League analysis that is data between 2014 and 2019 from a number of teams. And that comparison I did against Colombian First Division. And that's, again, similar patterns as we eventually saw here in the larger. I thought 250 players was quite a decent data set until VALD Data Lake. But yes, age analysis basically showed different patterns for different metrics. I mean, not a different pattern for every metric, but jump height showed a sort of age-related decline. Some other metrics like con impulse 100, con RPD, stiffness. In fact, most of those time-constrained type of force metrics or and stiffness-related peaked around 25, 26 rather than in the youngest group, which is really I thought really interesting of itself, which times with the peak and the peak age of first team Premier League players. And then again, there's a sort of turn off and an increase in later, in older players. But it wasn't longitudinal, it was serial cross-sectional. In position, there's also differences. So a central midfield will have higher stiffness values than external wingers and fullbacks, and the reverse with concentric peak power for the wide players higher and the central midfielders lower. So there is positional differences which may be influencing norms at some point in the future as well. But the last thing I just wanted to say on that data and the comparison across leagues and medians and so forth, and I think it's been raised by a couple of teams from the last report that the median in this data set, in the sort of Premier League data, is quite low in relation to what their first team player norms are or means on obviously a much smaller scale. And as it's stated in that early report, it's a Premier League plates, but there are a number of different there are players that are probably under 23s. They're not only first team players that are playing every week. But when you look at the 75th percentile, that seems to really align with what I'm seeing at the first team regular starters, if you like, group. The other thing is that the median is almost identical for a lot of metrics the median, the PL median from last year and this year for certain metrics, I think for Con Impulse and Con 100, it's within 1 or 2% of the median in this analysis I did with data from 2014 to 2018. So what that says, and this was all first team players. So what that says is that these players that there's 15, depends which metric, 15, 20, sometimes more percentage increase in the median, in the normal profile of first team players, which is really interesting of itself. And again, it's non-uniform. So EDRFD has increased more than con-peak power. And there's a whole roast. That's another podcast in itself. But, the point is that the similarity between that broader group and first team 4 or 5 years ago, and then the fact that first team now is at the 75th of the broader group, it's great. It kind of is a virtuous circle of, it shows that the big data is actually telling you a lot, even though it's we don't know the conditions exactly and so forth, but it's really useful. You just might shift your sort of target point, but it also, for me, having my smaller 250 data set sort of feels like it confirms that as well, because the differences and with the published data from Aspetar. So I think we're really getting closer to understanding profiling for neuromuscular profiling and the metrics of value and the metrics that provide information gain and insights through this process. So
I'll finish on the point. You were there, I was there, a few others were there as well at our VALD X events earlier this year in LA and Dallas, and we got insights into like the data science process. So it's it's no shock that we're dealing with hundreds of thousands of data points for all of these reports, and the way that they go about cleaning the data, the amount that they're using. There's always kind of maybe initial pushback into, when you've got so much data, there must be so much noise in the data as well. But with more data and more good data in the way that they go about cleaning it, you can start to see the median, the mean, and those standard deviations above and below. They get tighter and tighter and tighter. So, being involved, I'm pretty confident in it because I've seen it. But I think as we go down this route into 2026 and beyond, we're going to be sharing more and more insights into that. And it's an interesting time and an exciting time as well when you've got so much data. It's about presenting it in the best way to inform practitioners and let them know what's going on. So no, that's great. Dan, I think we're at the end. That's well over an hour. And what I will say is we've spoke for about an hour on just small snippets of the report. So there's so much more potentially that you can get from the report, and I would urge people to download the report first of all. So it's going to be available, as with all of our normative data reports, you go to your VALD Hub account, you can go to the dashboard section, and there's a little drop down on top where you'll access the normative data reports folder, and you can download it from there. If anyone watching this is interested in learning a bit more about VALD technology, or you're a current client and you want to get in touch with some feedback, please go to our website, fill out a contact form, and a member of our staff, our local representative, will be in touch ASAP. And for webinars, podcasts, events like this, don't forget to follow VALD on all of our social media platforms, Instagram, LinkedIn, Facebook, to keep up to date with the most recent and the most current events that are coming up as well. And beyond that, Dan, I just want to say thank you so much for your insights, for the contributions to the report, from Dr. Morgan Williams as well, and his contributions. And if there's anything you want to add to close up or to finish, please be my guest.
Just sort of circling it back a little to that normative and the data lake piece. I mean, I admit I was skeptical with that amount of data. That not the amount. No one has a problem with the amount, but obviously it's anonymized, and that's something that teams will appreciate. But at the same time, it means that the conditions, whether injured or not, and so forth, the precise ID of that player, whether they are a regular first team player. But what, I'm struck by having smaller data sets alongside that, how good this is in the end, how good it is, and just understanding obviously where to use it, and simply, shifting across. If you want to talk about first team player, you just go across. And the second thing that I want to say, because I always feel there's a jump height bashing fashion, and I keep mentioning other metrics than jump height. I think we just need to maintain our interest and value on jump height as a metric. It's just that independently, the force plate and these other metrics are giving you other insights. It's not that they're better insights necessarily, they're other insights. And so just, let's keep an open mind, and open and also a skeptical mind. But this type of data is really allowing us to be more confident about those choices, and to know, if you are limiting the number of metrics, you hopefully know what you're losing by not looking at things, or gaining by adding. So yeah, fantastic to be involved and to see the growth. Very proud. Little part I contributed to that.
Great. I think that is the best way to close this out. So again, Dan, thank you so much for your time, and we'll talk soon.
Thank you.